Will, I wanted to start by asking you about this word conservative that you used. And I know you used it advisedly, and I think Eisenhower would have thought of himself as a conservative, as you show. What did that mean to him? Because I find for my undergraduates, they throw this word around, and usually I don't know what it means at all. But if they do have a definition for it, it's usually almost opposite of the way Eisenhower would have thought about it. So how did he think about being a conservative?
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that, and this is true of many people who run as conservatives if they're successful, is that he didn't govern as a conservative when he became president. So Eisenhower was, he was not a career politician. He was an outsider. He was a general. What did he know? He was just going to go for it. So he read the tea leaves and said, look, the Democrats have been in charge. They've created this, government by deficit. The debt was huge. The government had grown enormously in just a very short period of time, and his view was it had gotten too big. So what he meant by conservative was shrinking the size of government, that government should play a role in the lives of citizens only when citizens were in trouble or had fallen afoul of things, that they shouldn't, through the results of crises, no fault of their own, they shouldn't suffer, that basically the government should provide a safety net for people who are left behind, but then it should get out of the way. Now, this is a mythological idea. I'm not sure that government can do that. So, the idea, Eisenhower was never going to dismantle the New Deal. He was never, in fact, just the opposite. He expanded Social Security. He increased the minimum wage. He built infrastructure projects. He established the Health, Education, and Welfare Department. Those were consistent in his view with the proper role of government, which was essentially to grease the wheels for innovation and prosperity by individuals. So, Elizabeth Warren and her, like, you didn't build that. Well, in a way, Eisenhower was sort of saying, right, I'm going to build the highways because only government can do that. I'm going to build, the infrastructure. That's my role. And then you will make the ideas flow. You will make us rich through prosperity and innovation. I think that's what he meant by conservative. He meant limiting government to what it does best and then stopping.
Right.
He's onto something. I mean, government does have a propensity to expand in every conceivable way, and our expectations of what government is supposed to do for us have changed a lot since the 1950s.
Right. The important point here is that he wasn't anti-government. He had spent his entire life in government, and he saw the essential role that government had to play in certain areas.
That's right. I mean, the famous Reagan line about, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you. That's the scariest line in the English language. Reagan got a lot of mileage out of that. Eisenhower wouldn't have accepted that at all. He wouldn't have understood that as a joke.
And so, Will, just building on that, and one of the real strengths of your book is looking at Eisenhower's foreign policy and its connection to his thinking about the world and thinking about government. How would you explain the fact that Eisenhower was a cold warrior, certainly, but at the same time, you don't see a lot of military interventions overseas. You see covert activities, but you don't see the kind of buildup you have in Vietnam. You don't see an Iraq War version under Eisenhower. How would you characterize his foreign policy?
Well, Eisenhower was constantly searching for the best means to, protect and advance American interests in the world short of war. And, it sounds easy, but of course it proved to be very, very difficult. He was quite good at it. And the very simple maxim that he held, I think, very, very seriously, took very seriously, was peace through strength. Eisenhower basically invented the strategy that America would use to wage and finally win the Cold War. One of the things you're absolutely right on this contradiction. On the one hand, Eisenhower has managed to avoid war throughout almost all of his time in office. He stays out of Indochina in 1954, stays out of Suez in 1956, manages to avoid a war over Berlin, stays out of Cuba, although there's a lot of covert operations going on there. But at the same time, in the 1950s, the United States started spending on defense more than it had ever done in any peacetime period. And in fact, more than it's ever done during peacetime. 10% of GDP was going into our defense budget, where it's only about 3.5% now. So he built up an enormous defense establishment to intimidate and to deter enemies. And he then had to play a pretty good game of saying, I really will nuke you if you cross this line. Now, thank God no one ever crossed the line. But Jeremy, as you and I know, Eisenhower kept it pretty close to the vest as to whether he would really use nuclear weapons or go to war to protect an ally or to protect Western Europe or whatever the case may be. So it was a combination of deterrence, very wily keeping the other guy guessing. But also a real sense that small brush fire wars were just the kind of thing that would damage American prestige, prosperity, would hurt America in the Cold War rather than help it.
Right, right. And as you point out, his saber rattling and his crisis management often brought some very scary moments, such as the crises around China repeatedly. It was a scary time to be thinking about. They only look stable in retrospect in some respects.
That's a great point. You know, we think of it, oh boy, everything was pretty quiet, you know, in the Cold. No way. Cold War was extremely dangerous in the 50s. Nuclear weapons, other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, the conflict over Taiwan and China was probably the second most dangerous conflict in the Cold War.
Right, right. So we have some great questions coming in from teachers, Will. Chase Coulter asks about the connection to von Braun. I knew, and you knew that would bring out a question too. It always does. How was that received? What did people think about the Nazi connections? We all know that this is brought up in Dr. Strangelove and Stanley Kubrick's brilliant film, right? How was this seen in the 1950s?
Well, look, this was a success story. I'm not saying that now. I mean, this is how it could be depicted. Something like 1,600 Nazi scientists were purloined out of Germany at the end of the war. You know, Operation Paperclip, it was called. They got all these Nazi scientists out of Germany, and many of them then, you know, told a tale about how, boy, they really never wanted the Nazis to win. In fact, they were slowing down their research. They kept the good stuff hidden. They didn't want to help Hitler get a nuclear weapon, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for von Braun, that's not really the case. I mean,
no.
he participated eagerly. He was very ambitious. And yet, you know, the malleability of the switch in our conceptions of who the great enemy was. In 1945 it was Nazi Germany, in 1946 it's the Soviet Union, and it's all hands on deck. America is an occupation of Germany, it's rebuilding Germany. Plenty of former Nazis were in the West German government in the late 40s and early 50s, and America basically drew a curtain over all of that and said that's in the past. Now it's we have a common enemy in Soviet Union, and we need the brains of the former you know, servants of the Third Reich. If we can now deploy them against communism, what a victory that will be for us. So it should have been, let me put it this way, it should have been more embarrassing than it was.
Right, right. And of course, in the 1960s, with a new generation of Americans and a new generation of German citizens, this became more of an issue. One of the points raised by student protesters after you ended your lecture in the next decade would be just this point, that we were acting and taking too much from the fascists in our own society.
Right. I mean, it would be a second generation of students who were born after the war ended who would say, wait a minute, how can we be using these former Nazis to do X and such? In the 50s, there wasn't quite the same degree of introspection about it.
Really, really good point. Tracy Medina asks if you can discuss economic growth in the business and agricultural sectors in the 1950s. This is, of course, you know, many remember it as the greatest period of American economic growth. How do we understand that? How do we understand the connection between prosperity and economic growth during this period?
I mean, the 50s was a period of significant economic growth, probably not as much as we might sort of mythologize it. GDP grew nicely in the 1950s, but one of the interesting things is that Eisenhower, as a small government conservative, was also a budget hawk, and he worked extremely hard to balance the budget. So in 3 of the 8 budgets he balanced, and the others it was very little deficit spending. One of the biggest engines of economic growth is deficit spending. And so the reality is that a small government not spending nearly as much as it would do later in the 60s and in the Vietnam era meant that actually federal monies into the economy were limited heavily into the defense sector. So there were 2 pretty sharp recessions actually in the decade of the 50s, in the first term and in the second term. Unemployment spiked in the later 50s for a year or so, up almost into double digits. And Eisenhower took that was the period in 1958 when he was least popular in the country. So growth was a little bit uneven. The other thing, your questioner mentioned agriculture, and Eisenhower tried, and so did, you know, they tried to pass restrictions on federal spending on farms. That he didn't believe in huge amounts of subsidies to farming, but he could never get that through the Congress. So it was a battle. He wanted to spend less on agriculture, but the farm lobby was pretty savvy. But no, I mean, Eisenhower did not cut taxes. This is another, arguably another sort of anchor over the side of the economy. He did not cut the personal income. Marginal tax rates were through the roof in the 1950s. They were as high as 90% on the richest Americans, but most Americans were in the 30% range, or even higher. So he believed that you had to pay taxes in order to balance the budget. Nowadays we do the opposite: cut taxes and spend and spend and spend. Right. And that's what we're about to do right now to get us out of the hole that we're in. But so the ideas about economic management were very different in that decade from the way that they would be from the the 70s onward. Yes. And that was a part of the reason that the economy didn't grow as fast as it might have.
Excellent. That was very helpful. So Gregory Nichols asks about Earl Warren. I knew you were going to get a question about this too, yeah. Because Greg asks, as many of us know, Eisenhower, at least apocryphally, is believed to have said that Earl Warren was his greatest mistake. And you pointed out, as you do in your book, that he in some ways engineered Warren into this position, knowing the Braun case was coming. Why did he say that about Warren? And then what did Eisenhower think was his greatest success?
Right. So he didn't say that. That's important. He didn't say Warren was his greatest mistake. He did criticize Warren later, and I'll just say that he didn't criticize him on civil rights. So the upshot of the Warren appointment is that Eisenhower admired Warren and was glad that he had put a statesman rather than a lawyer, although Warren had been Attorney General of California, on the court. He admired his style. He admired that he had been in the sphere of political activity. But basically, Warren came in. He pushed ahead on civil rights. Eisenhower was uncomfortable with the Braun decision, no doubt. He would not have written it that way. He would not have pushed so fast, so far. But I couldn't find him denouncing Warren privately or publicly over the Braun decision. The thing to remember, though, is that the Warren court lasted a long time. Right. And where would be its great breakthroughs? Mostly in civil liberties, mostly in free speech issues, mostly on First Amendment protections, a search and seizure protection, the Miranda warnings, all of these things. That would later in life, in the 1960s, when Ike was out of office, he turned against Warren and the legacy of the court on those grounds. And he was quite opinionated and vocal about his criticism of Warren and the court on those topics. I just think it's important that it's not as if Ike woke up one day in May of 1954 and said, "What have I done? I don't want to have any, I don't want to have desegregated public schools." That's not the case. He wouldn't have gone as far as Warren did, but he supported desegregation.
Yeah, it's worth reminding people, right, that he had been part of desegregating the U.S. military forces. It had been Truman's order, but he had been part of that process and saw that it worked in the U.S. military. There's every reason to believe he thought that could work in education as well, right?
And Washington, D.C., they filed friend of the court briefs in various cases in Washington, D.C. to desegregate public eating and facilities there. So, yeah, I mean, he had a lot of friends in the South. Eisenhower had lived and worked in a segregated military. He knew the reality, how hard it would be to change it. And I think, as a cultural conservative, he was worried about the reaction. And guess what? He was right. There was a huge reaction, massive resistance. But of course, it had to happen.
Right. So we have time for one more question, Will, and I'm going to put the last two teacher questions together. These are from Dean Rogers and John Underwood. Dean asks about the coup in Iran, how we understand the coup in Iran. It's obviously a major event and a major legacy from Eisenhower's presidency. And then building off of that, John wants to know a little more about Eisenhower's thinking about foreign policy and how much it derived from his living abroad, all the time he spent in the Philippines, in Panama, in Europe, of course.
Yeah, I mean, just to take that last one, he was a worldly guy. A lot of people might think, boy, this guy from Kansas, or he must be very provincial. Eisenhower had spent a huge amount of his life abroad, serving in the military, quite right, about Panama, the Philippines, Europe. He'd been all over Europe. He traveled pretty much to every place in the world. I would argue that he was, perhaps one of the most, if not the most, experienced people to be elected president, given his role in the military and his travels and his knowledge of foreign governments and foreign leaders, et cetera. So his travels had a lot to do with his reading of the world. He really understood the world as a system. He understood how it fit together. On Iran, this is one of the great, and we could throw Guatemala in there too, but Eisenhower embraced the use of covert operations by the CIA to overturn governments that were hostile to American interests. He saw nothing wrong with that. And this is another connection to the World War II era. You know, if you were going to use secret operations and the OSS and SOE to destroy bridges and overturn collaborationist governments or hurt the Nazis in World War II, why wouldn't you do the same thing to the Soviets and their minions around the world during the Cold War? Now, we see it very differently. We know the immense costs that the coup in Iran, which Eisenhower was intimately involved in, cost the country, cost Iran, and then cost America's reputation in the Middle East for decades thereafter. It was a bad decision. But at the time, and we need to understand why they did it, at the time they thought of this as a great success. It was cheap, it was deniable, it put into power, strengthened the hold on power of the Shah of Iran, who was a great ally of the United States in a difficult neighborhood that America wanted influence in. So I think Eisenhower got terrible advice from his CIA director, Allen Dulles. I think the use of covert operations was a big mistake, and it remains a big stain on the administration, in my view. But that's not how they saw it. They saw these events as necessary, as crucial to American interests, as part of waging the Cold War, and to doing it on the cheap so that you could avoid conventional wars in the future.
Right. Great point. So I'm going to sneak one last one in, Will, as I know Murphy's coming on. I'm going to sneak one more in because it's a great question relevant for today. Frank Martinez asks about presidential transitions. He asked about the Truman to Eisenhower, but I also will ask about the Eisenhower to Kennedy. How would you characterize those two transitions on both ends of the Eisenhower presidency?
Yeah, interesting question. Well, of course, Eisenhower did attend the inauguration of his successor. No, but Truman and Eisenhower had worked closely together in the late 40s and early 50s when Eisenhower was the head of NATO. They knew each other intimately. They had a good working relationship. And then Eisenhower ran for president. And of course, what do you do when you run for president? You criticize the previous guy, whoever it is. And so he ran against the Truman record. And he said a lot of things that were were exaggerated about Truman's record. And Truman got hot under the collar and then said some things during the campaign that were extremely bad-tempered and extremely nasty. And of course, there's the whole Marshall and McCarthy story in there as well that poisoned the relationship. Truman and Eisenhower, this is my point, had a good relationship and it soured, and they really loathed each other by the time of the inauguration. They were barely on speaking terms. So it was very difficult for Truman to receive Eisenhower, which of course he did. It was difficult for Truman and Eisenhower to ride in the car together to the Congress for Eisenhower to be inaugurated. But they did it because, of course, the country and the traditions were much more important than their petty spat, and they both knew this. 8 years later, Eisenhower was incredibly angry that John Kennedy had won. He thought Kennedy was terrible. He was young, he was arrogant, he knew nothing, he had no experience. Mind you, he didn't really like Nixon either, but he wanted Nixon to win, and he was really angry that he couldn't win essentially a third term by having Nixon win. Nonetheless, of course, he was extremely gracious, invited Kennedy to the White House right after the election, met with him numerous times, gave him all the secrets, showed him around the White House. And then Kennedy consulted Eisenhower throughout his presidency, called him constantly, Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah, yeah. I so enjoy seeing the film of Kennedy's inauguration and Eisenhower sitting out there in the cold, and it's this terribly cold day. He shouldn't be out there, but he's sitting there listening to the person, give his inaugural address, who he hoped would never be president, right?
Right, and you'll know that at Kennedy says the torch has been passed to a new leader born in this century, which is like saying that doesn't include you, Eisenhower.
Yes. Murphy, I think we're ready to transition.